Hello, world history students. Today we'll be talking about the Treaty of Versailles and how this created a new Europe by rearranging territory and setting up conditions that would eventually cause the Second World War. In the previous section, we discussed how Woodrow Wilson's 14-point speech promised a path towards a more fair and lasting peace, and that this proposed plan for peace was a major reason why Germany chose to surrender when it did in September of 1918. However, when the Paris Peace Conference is held in 1919, Woodrow Wilson's plan is not what will come to pass, and the results of this peace conference will be significantly different from those of the ideas that were proposed by him in his speech. Instead, the Allied powers will hold the meeting without any of the defeated Central Powers present, and Britain, and in particular France, will be determined to make Germany pay for their role in the Great War. This treaty ends up dealing very harshly with Germany, and does not follow the 14 points for the most part. Germany will be required to accept full blame for causing this conflict, which is a ridiculous demand since we all know at this point by no means was Germany the only country that practiced any of the four causes for the war: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism, and that many countries, not just Germany, were responsible for this terrible conflict to happen. This was a silly requirement that Germany was forced to perform, but countries like France demanded that Germany accept full responsibility so that they'd be able to make them pay reparations. Again, reparations are payments for damages caused by war. And if Germany accepted blame, then they would be forced, or they would have to pay for all these damages. The reparations that Germany were forced to pay are set at such a high rate and such a high price that they are meant to prevent Germany from ever being able to economically recover from this punishment. So they'd be permanently weak, while the other countries benefited from all the money they got from them. There were also some major territorial changes that took place. The Alsace-Lorraine is a valuable area of land between the border of France and Germany, and this area of land had changed hands between France and Germany several times. Germany had acquired this territory from a previous war, and now they were being forced to give it back to France since they lost World War I. Another major territorial change was the creation of Poland. The location of Poland the location for the new area or the new state of Poland is going to cause a ton of animosity amongst the German citizens because it's going to be located in a place where it cuts off the eastern part of Germany from the remainder of Germany. It essentially divides Germany. And it's going to create this area of land called the Polish Corridor, which eventually is going to create a situation where many Germans are going to be desperate to reconnect this area of land back with Germany. Finally, Germany will be required to reduce the size of their military. They will no longer be allowed to have an army that has over 100,000 troops, which is a huge reduction. They also have to get rid of or limit different types of forms of military resources. So Germany will be forced to decrease the size of their artillery. They'll be forced to actually get rid of their entire air force. They won't be allowed to have any sort of warplanes or things like that. They'll have to get rid of their navy, or decrease the size of the navy, but get rid of their submarines. And they'll be forced really to limit all types of their armed forces. For a country of Germany's size, these were extremely harsh and unrealistic restrictions, and they were passed purposefully to make Germany so weak that they could not attack anyone ever again. The ultimate goal, really, of the Treaty of Versailles, from the point of view of the British and the French, was really to punish Germany rather than to establish a fair and lasting peace, which had been the goal of Woodrow Wilson in the United States. Other issues kind of rose up during the Treaty of Versailles as well and got handled by this dispute. For example, this phenomenon called national self-determination arises. National self-determination is the idea that an ethnic group should have the right to determine for itself how it is ruled and should be allowed to create its own country and its own form of government. National self-determination will be the guiding principle for determining where the borders for new countries will be created once the war ends. Large empires from the Central Powers, such as the Ottoman Empire and Austria-Hungary, will have to deal with self-determination as their empires are broken apart into smaller empires. And while this idea sounds good of allowing people and ethnic groups to determine new countries and the kind of governments they want to have, you cannot make everybody happy all the time. And as new countries are created, not everybody that's part of these new countries wants to be part of these new states. And a good example of this is Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia will be a new country that's created. It's made out of parts of Austria-Hungary and Germany, and it'll be comprised mostly of ethnic Czechs and ethnic Slovaks. But there will also be ethnic Germans that are living in Czechoslovakia. And these Germans are going to be upset that they are taken out of the German Empire and forced to live in this new country. And so it's going to create a situation where down the road, these Germans living in Czechoslovakia are going to try and encourage Germany to come back and take back or conquer this land and reabsorb it back into Germany, which will cause conflict in the 1930s. Another area where there's a lot of change after the war was the Ottoman Empire. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire was on the verge of collapse. And during the First World War, this empire will actually, unfortunately, play a rather infamous role in a pretty terrible event. Infamous means something that is known, but that you're not very proud of. And the Ottoman Empire will participate and carry out the Armenian genocide. That's the infamous event. Genocide is the systematic extermination of a group of people, often a particular ethnic group. And in this case, it was the Armenian people. Armenians were an ethnic minority living in the Ottoman Empire. They practiced Orthodox Christianity as compared to the Muslim majority of their Turkish rulers. So there had long been animosity between the Armenians and the Turkish rulers. And then during the First World War, Armenians were targeted for emigration, meaning the government wanted them to leave the country. And the government did so forcibly using the military. And oftentimes they would take the Armenians out of their homes and march them by force through deserts without proper rations of food, no shelter, and really no water. And it was pretty clear that the tactics that were being used were meant to kill the Armenian people as you're being forced out of the country. And as a result of this, before the war, there were roughly 2 million Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire. And by the end of the war, that population, of that 2 million, 1 to 1.5 million will be killed. And essentially, when the war ends, there will be a virtually non-existent Armenian population in the Ottoman Empire. Unfortunately, this is not the last genocide of the 20th century, and we're going to learn more about some of these horrific events later on during this trimester. The Ottoman Empire will also be forced to realign and lose a lot of its territory. The empire had a ton of territory to the east, especially east of the Mediterranean, and very valuable oil-rich lands. And these regions will be turned into new nations that will be governed under this thing called the Mandate System. Under the Mandate System, these new countries are created, countries like Syria, Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. But they will not be allowed to govern themselves. Instead, they'll be governed by Britain and France, and essentially ruled by these two countries until Britain and France determine they are ready to govern themselves on their own. And so this is really kind of biased point of view. These countries, Britain and France, are basically saying that these other countries aren't developed enough to govern themselves, and so they'll govern them until they're ready. And if you are someone from Syria or Palestine and you're looking at this mandate system essentially looks like imperialism, but just by another name. And you're pretty upset about this because even though you're being told you're an independent country, you really aren't independent. You're still under the watch and leadership of a European power. Finally, Russia is going to lose territory as well after the war. This is because the Baltic states of Finland, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania had all declared their independence from Russia when Russia became the Soviet Union. And these new states will be recognized by the victorious Allied powers because the Allied powers are anti-communist, and they want to weaken and limit the influence of the newly formed Soviet Union and prevent the spread of communism. All right, so why would President Wilson give this great speech about the 14 points and a fair and lasting peace, yet agree to this clearly unfair treaty that was the Treaty of Versailles? Well, he agreed to these harsh terms of the treaty so that he could have the League of Nations created. Wilson believed that the League of Nations, this general association of nations that would solve problems through diplomacy and working together instead of fighting them out on the battlefield, would be strong enough to solve any problem that came up as a result of these harsh terms from the treaty. And his ultimate goal was to promote international cooperation and to keep peace by reducing arms and settling disputes through conversations. The League of Nations functioned by having an assembly of nations, a council, and by working closely with an organization called the World Court. This World Court would be a permanent and permanently created body and would determine cases that involved international law. The League of Nations would enforce its decisions by imposing economic sanctions and blocking trade with countries who perform aggressive actions or disregard the League's decisions. It will become clear, though, early on that these methods of enforcing their policies and their rulings would not be strong enough to prevent countries from ignoring the decisions made by the League of Nations. So while this league is a good idea, it's going to be quite weak. And it makes these sort of rulings and decisions that the countries that break these rules really don't care because the league has no way of enforcing them, and they often just ignore the league. The League of Nations is going to support the mandate system that was discussed on the previous slide, which again is this policy of having a colony governed by a so-called advanced Western nation until it is ready for independence. And this essentially is imperialism by a different name and is a huge slap in the face to the people living in those countries that were just created, who feel like they've always been ready to rule themselves, but these European powers just showed up and began placing restrictions on them. So there are major flaws with this League of Nations. It no longer exists today and has actually been replaced by the United Nations because of the flaws that we had just discussed. One problem with the League of Nations was that some major world powers never actually even join it. So, for example, the United States never joined the League of Nations. The United States Senate believes this organization would drag the United States into conflicts that we as a country just didn't belong in. And so they're going to deny or veto acceptance of this. So even though it was the U.S. president's idea to create this and he fought hard to create it, the U.S. won't join it because Congress is going to say no, which is going to lead to a lot of issues. The League of Nations is also going to have limited ability to enforce its decisions, which we already talked about. So while they can place these economic sanctions and they can publicly scold countries that are being aggressive, they're going to have no way of enforcing it. They cannot use any military troops, or they cannot have or force members of their league to send military troops to put down a crisis. So there's no physical way for the league to actually enforce their actions. And this is going to be a major flaw for the league and will be exposed by the fascist leaders such as Mussolini and Hitler, as well as imperialistic Japan during the 1930s in the buildup to World War II. So that was the Treaty of Versailles. It sets up the conditions for a Second World War, and it hurts Germany by putting them in a position where they really felt like they had no other option but to start to militarize and to violate many of the terms of this treaty.